Dawn breaks over East Anglia, and hundreds of American airmen pray for an easy mission. But this morning, the backbone of America's bomber arm, the B-17 Flying Fortress, will carry them into the heart of Germany, aiming for Regensburg's Messerschmitt factory and Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants, a single target supplying nearly 40% of Hitler's war machine with a part he cannot fight without. US commanders still believe 13 guns per bomber and tight combat boxes will hold the sky. But in a few hours, those hopes will clash with wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters, and the fate of an entire campaign will hinge on whether doctrine or reality proves deadlier. What happened next would change Allied air power forever, and it begins here. Mist clings to the runways of East Anglia as the first faint light spills across the airfield. Engines cough and rumble in the half-dark, sending puffs of exhaust drifting low over lines of olive-drab bombers. Ground crews, faces drawn and silent, check oil levels, tighten bolts, and wipe frost from plexiglass turrets. Every rivet, every round of ammunition gets a second look. The ritual is as familiar as breathing. Inspect, adjust, repeat, because lives depend on it. Inside the Quonset huts, airmen lace boots with numb fingers, their breath clouding in the chill. Some cradle mugs of burnt coffee, others run gloved hands over the lucky tokens tucked into flight jackets. Conversation is sparse, replaced by the scrape of chairs and the low shuffle of boots on concrete. The only certainty is the waiting. Above the steady drone of generators, the distant echo of a bugle signals another mission. Heads turn, eyes meet, and the quiet hope for a milk run, an easy sortie, maybe a target in France, hangs in the air. But no one says it aloud. In these pre-dawn hours, superstition and routine offer the only comfort before the orders come down. On the line, the B-17s sit ready, silvered by dew, their crews steeling themselves for whatever the day will bring. The doors to the briefing room swing open, and a wave of cold air follows the officers as they stride to the front. Maps are unrolled, targets circled in red grease pencil. The day's orders are clear: Regensburg and Schweinfurt. For the men crowded shoulder to shoulder, the names hit like a punch. Regensburg means the Messerschmitt factory, the main artery for Germany's Bf-109 fighter, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's defense. Knock it out, and the enemy bleeds fighters for months. But Schweinfurt is the real shock. The city's factories produce nearly 40% of all ball bearings used by the German war machine. Every tank tread, every airplane propeller, every truck engine depends on those tiny steel spheres. Destroy Schweinfurt, and the gears of the entire Nazi war effort could grind to a halt. The officers don't sugarcoat it. These are not soft targets. Both lie deep in Germany, far beyond the reach of friendly fighters. The planners believe the risk is worth it. Cripple the Bf-109 line and choke off ball bearings, and the Reich's armies will stall. The stakes are spelled out in numbers and charts, but the meaning is plain enough. Today, the 8th Air Force aims for the enemy's heart, and the cost will be measured in blood and metal. With the targets set deep inside enemy territory, the plan rested on a single, unshakable belief. The doctrine, architects in Washington and London argued that the B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with 13.50 caliber machine guns, could protect itself against any fighter the Luftwaffe might throw its way. Each bomber carried a crew of 10, every man trained to work his station as part of a larger, living machine. In the air, these crews would fly in tight, box-shaped formations, 3 tiers stacked in a staggered grid, each bomber's guns overlapping with the next. The geometry was no accident. By locking wings at precise intervals, the bombers created a wall of interlocking fire, a fortress in the sky that, on paper, left no opening for enemy fighters to slip through. Commanders called it the combat box. The lead ship set the pace and altitude, while the others followed, each trusting the man beside him to hold formation no matter what. The theory was simple: massed firepower and discipline would beat speed and surprise. American planners saw no need for long-range escort fighters. The Flying Fortress, they believed, was both spear and shield, able to strike hard and strong enough to defend itself all the way to the target and back. It was a vision built on confidence in machinery, mathematics, and the courage of young men. But the real test, waiting in the skies over Germany, would reveal just how much faith could withstand steel and fire. The shuttle strike plan was ambitious, almost audacious. Instead of turning for home after Regensburg, the lead wing would press on, skimming the Alps and landing in North Africa. This maneuver, a first for the 8th Air Force, was designed to stretch the Luftwaffe thin, forcing German fighter controllers to split their response, chasing one bomber stream toward Italy while another veered northeast for Schweinfurt. In theory, the plan would scatter enemy resistance and buy precious minutes of breathing room for both groups. In practice, it depended on clockwork timing and perfect weather. Neither would hold. As the first bombers clawed for altitude over East Anglia, the Regensburg force formed up quickly, engines thundering in tight stacks above the morning haze. The Schweinfurt wing, tangled in fog and confusion, lagged behind, its takeoff delayed by more than an hour. The carefully calculated 30-minute gap between the two streams stretched to over 75 minutes, unraveling the synchronized assault before the bombers even reached the channel. Each group now flew alone, exposed on separate vectors, their mutual protection lost to the weather and the clock. German radar stations along the coast picked up the inbound formations almost immediately. Chain home plots tracked the bomber streams as they crossed into occupied Europe. Luftwaffe sector controllers, reading the pattern, realized the Americans were attempting a double strike. Fighters scrambled from airfields across Belgium and Western Germany, massing in numbers not seen since the spring. Over 300 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were hurled at the Regensburg force, guided by sector chiefs who learned to concentrate their attacks at the most vulnerable points in the bomber stream. The head-on tactic, perfected over months of trial and error, now paid off. German pilots dove straight at the lead elements, exploiting the B-17's weaker nose defenses. Machine gun fire stitched through the air, traces converging on the cockpit and bombardier's compartment. The bombers answered with every gun they had, but the sky was thick with enemy fighters. Gaps opened in the formation as stragglers fell away, engines trailing smoke, wings sheared by cannon shells. Formation leaders barked orders over intercoms, urging their crews to hold tight, to keep the combat box intact. But as the bomber stream stretched and thinned, the wall of fire that doctrine promised began to buckle. The plan's flaw was now exposed. Alone and outnumbered, the low groups took the brunt of the assault. Within minutes, entire squadrons were cut to pieces. The Luftwaffe had learned to wait for the moment when discipline faltered and spacing widened, then strike with overwhelming force. The shuttle concept, bold on paper, left the most vulnerable bombers to face the tiger's jaws alone. The 100th Bomb Group took its place in the low group, the most exposed position in the bomber stream. Within minutes of crossing into enemy airspace, the sky above Germany turned into a killing ground. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs came in head-on, their cannon fire stitching through the nose of the lead ships. The combat box, so precise in theory, unraveled in the chaos. When one B-17 slid out of position, engine smoking, glass blown out, another tried to fill the gap, only to be caught in the crossfire. Intercoms crackled with shouted warnings and desperate calls for help. Eyewitnesses later recalled the scene as a blur of flames and falling metal. Entire squadrons vanished in a matter of minutes. In the space of a single attack run, the 100th lost nearly a dozen aircraft, crews bailing out over enemy territory, parachutes blooming against the haze, some never seen again. Those who survived described the smell of burning oil, the sting of cordite, and the sickening jolt as flak tore through the fuselage. Captain Robert Rosenthal, flying his first mission with the group, watched as his wingman's bomber erupted in a ball of fire. He would later write, "You simply do the job, you have no choice." For the men of the 100th, there was no time to grieve, only the relentless focus on holding formation, keeping the guns firing, and praying the engines would hold. On the ground, the name began to circulate, the Bloody 100th. It was more than a nickname, it was a warning, a badge, and a reminder of how quickly a unit could be gutted by a single pass of enemy fighters. Survivors counted the empty bunks that night, the missing faces at the mess. For the 100th, the war would be measured not just in miles flown or bombs dropped, but in friends lost over foreign fields. Their ordeal became legend, a symbol of the human cost behind every mission charted on a map. October 14, 1943, would be remembered by every man in the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday. At sunrise, 229 B-17s lifted off from rain-soaked runways, engines straining under the weight of bombs and hope. The target was Schweinfurt. Again, commanders sent the bombers deep into Germany without adequate escort, relying on the same doctrine that had already cost so much. Once over the continent, the bombers encountered a wall of resistance. Luftwaffe fighters, refueled and waiting, tore into the formations in coordinated waves. Head-on attacks shattered the lead elements, while flak batteries below filled the sky with deadly bursts. By the end of the mission, 60 flying fortresses had been shot down. 7 more limped home only to be written off as beyond repair. Of the remaining planes, 138 bore scars, holes punched through wings and fuselage, engines coughing oil, control cables frayed or severed. Only a handful landed unscathed. Crew lists told the rest of the story. More than 630 airmen were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in a single day. The airfields of East Anglia, usually alive with the roar of returning squadrons, fell silent as ground crews counted the missing. Group leaders gathered around operations boards, scanning the columns of tail numbers. Some units lost nearly half their strength before reaching the target. Debriefings were brief and grim. Navigators described formation after formation vanishing from view. Pilots reported engines failing, wings sheared by cannon shells, and desperate attempts to stay in the box as the stream unraveled. In the mess halls that night, empty chairs outnumbered the living. The numbers were stark. Of 229 bombers dispatched, more than a quarter never returned. The loss rate was unsustainable. Charts and graphs could not soften the reality. No amount of firepower or formation discipline could shield the bombers from such concentrated attack. On Black Thursday, the promise of self-defending formations was shattered, replaced by a new understanding. Without fighter escort, every deep strike was a gamble, with odds growing longer by the day. Inside the flying fortress, the war pressed closer than any enemy fighter. The ball turret, a glass bubble slung beneath the belly, was the loneliest post of all. Gunners squeezed themselves into the cramped sphere, knees tucked to chin, feet braced against cold metal. Once locked in, there was no room to move, just the hiss of oxygen, the rattle of guns, and the endless vibration of the engines. From that perch, the world narrowed to a spinning horizon of cloud, tracer fire, and the black puffs of flak. Many gunners wrote later that they measured time not in minutes, but in bursts, each explosion a reminder that escape was impossible until the wheels touched grass again. The strain seeped into every part of the crew's life. Diaries and letters home rarely mentioned fear outright, but the signs were everywhere. Men who refused to shave before a mission, convinced it brought luck. Others who carried the same coin or rabbit's foot on every flight. Some airmen kept a tally of their missions on the inside of their jackets, crossing off each one with a trembling hand. The Army's flight surgeons watched the toll mount. Medical records from the 8th Air Force show that for every 1,000 men who flew, about 42 broke down with psychiatric illness, combat exhaustion, anxiety, or what they called flying fatigue. Over time, nearly 4,000 men would be sent home, unable to face another mission. Command tried to stem the tide with a simple offer: flak leave. After a set number of sorties, sometimes as few as 10, crews could claim a week away from the front lines. Officially, this was a reward for surviving the odds. Unofficially, it was a safety valve. Some men spent their leave in London, others wandered the countryside, but all carried the same burden: the knowledge that rest was only a pause in the cycle. The war and the next mission waited for them back in East Anglia. The ball turret gunner's fate became a symbol for the risks every man faced. The famous poem, Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, captured the cold reality. Survival was never guaranteed, and even the strongest could be undone by a single burst of flak. In the end, superstition, routine, and the brief respite of flak leave were the only shields against a war that demanded more than just courage. For the men of the 8th, the greatest battle was often fought in the mind. A battered B-17 limps over the coast of England, its tail nearly torn away by cannon fire. The rudder flutters in the slipstream, one engine feathered, fuel streaming from holes in the wing. On the ground, crews scanned the horizon for returning shapes, counting engines, searching for familiar nose art. Each survivor that touches down carries the scars of the day. Jagged holes patched with sheet metal, scorched paint, shattered perspex, and sometimes a wheel-up landing that leaves the fortress skidding to a stop, its crew scrambling clear. The Flying Fortress earns its name not by invincibility, but by a stubborn refusal to quit. Engineers built the B-17 with a strong, boxy frame and redundant systems, twin spars in the wings, multiple hydraulic lines, and a web of bracing that could absorb punishment. Maintenance logs from the 384th and 379th bomb groups read like triage reports: aircraft returning with a wing nearly severed, vertical stabilizers shot away, engines hanging by a thread. One fortress, Ice-Cold Katy, landed missing most of its tail. Another, 10 nights in a barroom, came home with more than 200 holes punched through its fuselage, yet the crew walked away unhurt. On the hard stands, ground crews work miracles with what they have. Sheet aluminum scavenged from wrecks, parachute silk, and even canvas are pressed into service for quick repairs. Mechanics swarm over battered airframes, pounding out dents, riveting on patches, and swapping engines under the glare of portable floodlights. In the rush to keep the bombers flying, some repairs are crude but effective, anything to get the fortress back in the air by dawn. Crews joke that a B-17 can fly with half a tail, 2 engines, and a prayer. For many, it's not far from the truth. Each bomber carries its own identity, painted in bold letters or cartoon mascots on the nose. Memphis Belle, Hell's Kitchen, Sentimental Journey, names that turn machines into partners, reminders that survival depends on teamwork between man and metal. Airmen believe their luck rides with the plane, and ground crews treat every patch and painted emblem as a kind of talisman. Letters home describe the feeling of running a hand over a fresh patch, hoping it will hold for one more mission. The bond between crew and fortress is forged in crisis. Pilots tell of flying with jammed elevators, coaxing crippled ships home with only ailerons and trim tabs. Gunners recall stuffing rags into leaking fuel lines or kicking free jammed landing gear. After every mission, the battered survivors stand as proof. Resilience is not just a matter of steel, but of will. The B-17's toughness buys time, hope, and sometimes a second chance. But even the strongest fortress cannot stand alone forever. The need for a better answer, something beyond courage and quick repairs, grows with every mission. The answer arrived in the form of a simple corrugated metal tank, just big enough to hold 108 gallons of high-octane fuel, light enough to hang beneath a fighter's wing. Colonel Hub Zemke and his pilots in the 56th Fighter Group pushed hard for these drop tanks, convinced that range, not firepower, would win the battle over Germany. Early skeptics called them fire hazards, doubted their reliability, and feared they would slow the big P-47 Thunderbolts to a crawl. But desperation forced innovation. Field trials proved the tanks safe, and by early 1944, American fighters began to slip farther into enemy territory with every mission. The effect was immediate. P-47s, once limited to the Belgian border, now roared all the way to Berlin and back. The arrival of twin-engine P-38 Lightnings, and soon after, the sleek P-51 Mustang, pushed the reach of escort even deeper. Suddenly, bomber crews spotted friendly fighters overhead as they crossed the Rhine, then again over the target, and once more on the way home. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced not just the guns of the Flying Fortress, but the teeth of American fighter cover from takeoff to touchdown. The numbers told the story. Loss rates for B-17 crews dropped sharply as the escort fighters carved through enemy interceptors. Fighter group logs from the spring of 1944 list dozens of German planes shot down in a single day, while bomber formations returned with fewer gaps and fewer empty bunks. Zemke's Wolfpack and other groups became legends in their own right, their pilots trading radio calls with bomber crews above the clouds. The offensive, once on the brink of collapse, found its second wind. With the sky no longer a one-sided killing ground, planners could look beyond mere survival and set their sights on the next set of targets. The path was open, and the fortress would not have to fly alone again. With the bombers no longer flying alone, planners in England could finally look beyond survival. The new question was how to break the backbone of German resistance for good. Intelligence pointed to a single glaring vulnerability: oil. Every tank, every fighter, every truck in the Reich ran on fuel refined in a handful of giant plants scattered across Germany and occupied Europe. Rail lines and marshalling yards, too, formed the arteries that kept the factories supplied and the armies moving. Destroy these, and the enemy's war machine would seize up, no matter how many ball bearings or aircraft factories remained. The oil and rail offensive began in earnest in the spring of 1944. B-17s, now escorted all the way to Target and back, thundered towards synthetic fuel plants at places like Mersburg, Lohna, and Politz. The targets were massive and well defended, ringed with flak towers and camouflaged by smoke screens. Yet the results were undeniable. By the end of summer, German fuel production had collapsed. Fighter squadrons sat idle for lack of gasoline, panzer divisions rationed every drop, and supply trains stalled on shattered tracks. Railway yards at Hamm, Ludwigshafen, and Munich became craters visible from miles above, choking the flow of men and material to every front. As D-Day approached, the bombers shifted focus again, hammering bridges, tunnels, and junctions across northern France. The goal was simple: isolate the battlefield, cut off German reinforcements, and pave the way for the Allied landings. In the weeks after June 6, 1944, the rail net west of the Seine collapsed almost entirely. By autumn, German commanders described their transport system as paralyzed. For the first time since the war began, the enemy's armies were stranded, unable to move or resupply at will. The fortress, now flying under the shield of its escorts, had helped turn the tide not just in the air, but across the whole of Europe. But as the Luftwaffe faded, a new threat waited ahead, one that no fighter could chase away. The Luftwaffe's grip on the skies may have slipped, but danger for the bombers only changed its shape. As the Allied air campaign pressed deeper into the heart of Germany, a new threat waited below, one that could not be outflanked or shot down. The Ruhr corridor, stretching nearly 100 kilometers from the Dutch border to the industrial cities of Essen and Dortmund, became a gauntlet lined with anti-aircraft guns. On paper, the numbers defied belief: up to 1,500 heavy flak guns, 8.8, 10.5, and even 12.8 centimeter batteries, packed along the main approach routes. In the densest stretches, a single kilometer might bristle with 100 barrels, all waiting for the telltale drone of incoming engines. What made these defenses truly lethal was not just their scale, but their precision. Each battery was paired with Würzburg radar sets, 3-meter dishes spinning in the fields and on factory rooftops, their beams sweeping the sky for high-flying targets. Once a bomber stream crossed into range, the radar operators tracked altitude, speed, and heading, feeding real-time data to the gun crews. Within seconds, batteries could shift aim, recalibrate fuses, and concentrate fire on a single squadron. In cloud or darkness, the accuracy barely faltered. Allied crews learned to dread the moment the flak began. First a few distant puffs, then a wall of black bursts, each one close enough to rattle teeth and punch holes through aluminum and flesh. Electronic warfare teams on board the B-17s fought back with chaff. Thin strips of aluminum, codenamed Window, designed to confuse radar echoes. Jamming transmitters, nicknamed Carpet and Mandrel, tried to drown out the signals. Sometimes it worked, scattering the barrages just enough for a few more ships to slip through. But more often, the sky over the Ruhr remained a killing zone. Mission logs from the spring and summer of 1944 show that flak accounted for up to half of all bomber losses on certain raids, deadlier than fighters and impossible to avoid. For the men in the fortress, survival now depended on luck, discipline, and the hope that the next shell would pass just a little too high or a little too wide. The corridor was always waiting, and every mission meant running the gauntlet again. At war's end, the Flying Fortress met a quieter fate. Hundreds of battered B-17s, their missions finished, were ferried across the Atlantic and the American heartland to vast disposal fields: Kingman, Walnut Ridge, Altus. Rows of bombers stretched for miles, wings overlapping, nose art fading beneath the desert sun. Salvage crews, many veterans themselves, walked the lines, recording serial numbers, draining fuel, and stripping radios, engines, and guns for anything of value. The final act came quickly. Contracted scrappers cut through the aluminum skin, melting down the airframes that had once braved flak and fighters over Europe. By 1948, over 90% of all B-17s, more than 10,000 aircraft, were gone. The metal, once shaped for war, found new life in peacetime. Aluminum from Kingman and other boneyards was shipped overseas, helping to rebuild bridges in Holland, frame new homes in Britain, and restore the rails that crisscrossed a devastated continent. The fortress, forged for battle, became the scaffolding for recovery, a legacy measured not just in missions flown, but in the silent strength of steel and memory. Across the world, the few remaining B-17s stand as living echoes of a vanished era. Fewer than 50 complete airframes survive, and only a handful are still airworthy, each one the product of years of painstaking restoration by dedicated volunteers and veterans groups. At air shows from Texas to Duxford, the deep thrum of four Wright Cyclone engines draws crowds who watch, spellbound, as these giants once again lift into the sky. Museums preserve others under careful watch, their olive-drab skins polished, nose art lovingly restored, bomb bays open for new generations to peer inside. For every fortress that returns to flight, hundreds of hands labor over corroded spars, faded logbooks, and battered aluminum skins. Parts are scavenged from forgotten crash sites, while old blueprints are studied like scripture. Each rivet replaced is a tribute to the crews who once trusted their lives to these machines. Veterans organizations gather beneath the wings, swapping stories, reading names, and remembering the friends who never came home. The B-17 endures not just as hardware, but as a flying memorial, its shadow crossing fields and city streets, carrying with it the memories of sacrifice, resilience, and the hope that history will not be forgotten. By war's end, nearly 12,000 B-17 flying fortresses had rolled off American assembly lines, yet fewer than 50 remain airworthy today. The Regensburg, Schweinfurt raids exposed the limits of pre-war doctrine, showing that even a bomber with 13 guns needed fighter escort against determined Luftwaffe attacks. The loss of 60 B-17s over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, forced rapid adaptation, longer-range P-51 escorts, and a new focus on oil and rail targets. Declassified mission reports and medical records reveal not just technical innovation, but the heavy psychological toll on crews, with 42 cases of combat fatigue per 1,000 airmen. Today, surviving B-17s stand in museums and air shows as reminders, built for war, but now memorials to those who flew them and to the lessons learned about technology, courage, and adaptation.